Welcome in the journey of time. Tonight, we'll unfold another page of history. Perhaps you're lying in bed, or maybe you've simply decided to let the past accompany you for a while. Where are you joining me from tonight? Leave a comment if you'd like. I always enjoy hearing about your corner of the world. And what time is it for you now? If you find this slow and thoughtful stories of those who came before us brings you a sense of peace and comfort, I'd be honored if you subscribed. This is not a history lesson, it's a time machine. We will not just learn about the Ottoman Empire, we will live it. We will feel the sun on our faces in the courtyards of Topkapi and the mud of the trenches at Gallipoli. So let's begin. The Anatolian Plateau in the late 13th century was a world of ghosts and whispers. The great Seljuk Sultanate of Rum, which had once imposed a fragile order, lay in fragments, shattered by the Mongol whirlwind that had swept out of the east. The land was a chessboard for petty Turkish beyliks, each ruled by a bey who was little more than a warlord with ambitions as vast as the horizons they surveyed. The air itself tasted of dust and uncertainty. In the northwest, near the town of Sagat, the Kayi tribe, a branch of the Oghuz Turks, clung to a precarious existence. Their leader was Ertugrul Bey, a man whose face was a roadmap of a life lived in the saddle. His eyes, squinted against the sun, had seen the rise and fall of empires. He served the Seljuks loyally, a border guardian, and Yük Bey, his sword perpetually turned towards the fading but still formidable Byzantine Empire. His world was one of stark contrasts. The stark beauty of the highlands against the brutal reality of raid and counter-raid. The deep silence of the steppe broken by the sudden clash of steel. Ertugrul's son, Osman, was a product of this frontier. He was born to the rhythm of the horse's gallop and the call to prayer. But there was a pensiveness to him that set him apart. While other young men boasted of their prowess, Osman observed. He listened to the tales of travelers, to the grievances of the settled folk, to the wisdom of the dervishes who wandered the land. He understood that power was not just about the strength of one's arm, but about the loyalty of one's followers and the justice of one's rule. The night of the dream was unremarkable at first. A chill wind snaked down from the mountains, causing the flames of the campfires to dance and spit. Osman, weary from a day spent mediating a dispute between two of his father's commanders, finally retired to his simple tent. The ground was hard, the blankets coarse. Sleep, when it came, was a black, depthless void. Then the warmth began. It started as a tiny ember in his core, a point of heat that pulsed with a life of its own. It grew, not uncomfortably, but with an irresistible organic force. From this warmth, a tree erupted. It was no sapling. It was an ancient, colossal thing, bursting forth from his very being. Its roots were like great, muscular pythons, digging deep, cracking the bedrock of Anatolia. They did not stop. They spread in all directions, pushing under mountains and across seas, weaving themselves into the fabric of the continents. He saw the roots become rivers of legend. The Danube, a silver ribbon winding through dark forests. The Nile, a life-giving serpent in a desert of gold. The Tigris and Euphrates, the cradles of civilization itself. The trunk of the tree was a pillar holding up the sky, its bark like forged iron. And its branches, they reached for the heavens, a canopy that threatened to blot out the sun. But the leaves were not leaves. They were swords, countless scimitars, their curved blades catching a light from no visible source, each one honed to a razor's edge. A wind stirred, a sigh that became a gale. The sword leaves trembled, and then as one they turned, their points sharp as needles, all oriented towards a single, dazzling point on the horizon. A city. It was a city of walls that seemed built of solidified sunlight, of domes that glowed like pearls, of a presence so immense it seemed to hold the weight of history. Constantinople, the seat of the Caesars, the bastion of Christianity, the red apple of desire. It sat at the junction of two seas, pulsating with a power that was both alluring and defiant. A voice spoke. It had no location. It was simply there, imminent in the dreamscape. It was not loud, yet filled the entirety of his consciousness. Osman, son of Ertugrul, the fruit of your loins shall sit upon the throne that rises from this tree. Their shadow shall be protection for the people, and their justice shall flow as these rivers to the ends of the earth. Osman awoke with a jolt, his heart hammering against his ribs. The cold of the night was a physical shock. He was drenched in a sweat that had nothing to do with the temperature. He looked around. The camp was silent, save for the snorting of a horse and the cough of a sentry. The ancient oak tree under which he had often taken shade stood silent and unmoving. But everything was different. The dream was not a memory. It was a truth more fundamental than the ground he lay upon. He could still feel the phantom weight of the tree, the certainty of its roots. He rose, his limbs trembling. He walked to the edge of the camp, looking out into the darkness, towards the west where the great city lay. He knew, with a clarity that would dictate every breath he took for the rest of his life, that his destiny and the destiny of his people was irrevocably tied to that vision. The seed of an empire had been planted not in the soil, but in the soul of a man. Chapter 1. The first route, the taking of Bursa. The dream provided the compass, but the journey was made step by painful step. Osman Bey, after Ertugrul's death, became the leader of the Kei. He was no longer just a tribal chief. He was a man possessed by a divine mandate. His first significant act was the capture of the Byzantine fortress of Karakhisar around 1299. This was not the fall of a great city, but it was a declaration. The siege was a gritty, brutal affair. The Ottoman Akinchis, the lightning-fast raiders, circled the stone walls like wolves, their arrows a constant, buzzing menace. The defenders, a mix of professional Greek soldiers and frightened local levies, hurled down rocks and boiling pitch. The air was thick with the stink of fear and the coppery tang of blood. Osman did not command from a distant hill. He was in the thick of the fray, his face streaked with soot and sweat, his voice hoarse from shouting orders. His leadership was not that of a remote general, but of a fellow warrior. When a section of the wall was breached after weeks of pressure, it was Osman who was among the first through the gap, his sword a blur of steel. The fortress fell not through brilliant strategy, but through sheer, dogged persistence. But it was what happened after the victory that truly defined the Ottoman way. The conquering warriors, their blood still up, looked to their bey for the signal to plunder. But Osman raised a hand. He offered terms to the defeated garrison and the townspeople. Those who wished to leave could do so with their lives. Those who stayed could keep their homes, their property, and most importantly, their Christian faith. In return, they would pay a tax, the jizya, and acknowledge Ottoman rule. This was a revolution in a land used to slaughter and enslavement. It was a pragmatic calculation. A dead population cannot till fields or pay taxes, but was also a glimpse of a nascent imperial vision, a system of control tolerance that would later be formalized as the millet system. Osman's son, Orhan, was a different kind of leader. Where his father was the warrior prophet, Orhan was the architect administrator. He understood that a state needed a heart, a capital. His eyes settled on Bursa, a wealthy city nestled in the lush foothills of Mount Yaludag, famous for its silks and thermal baths. It was a prize worth any effort. Bursa was too strong for a direct assault. Instead, Orhan chose a strategy of slow strangulation. He captured the smaller towns and forts that formed Bursa's protective ring: Yarhisar, Kestel, and most symbolically, the fort of Orhanili, which commanded the roads to the city. For years, Bursa was isolated. Its gardens lay fallow, its markets grew empty, and the morale of its defenders ebbed away. The city became an island in an Ottoman sea. Finally, In 1326, after a virtual siege that lasted nearly a decade, the city's governor, Evrinos, knew the end had come. Resistance was futile. He negotiated a surrender. Orhan Gazi entered Bursa not as a barbarian conqueror, but as a sovereign claiming his birthright. His first act was to ride to the city's largest church, the Church of the Holy Apostles. He dismounted, removed his boots, and entered the sacred space. He knelt not before the cross, but in the direction of Mecca, and offered a prayer of thanks to God. The church was consecrated as a mosque. The sound of the Christian bell, which had marked the hours for centuries, was joined and then superseded by the Muslim call to prayer, the adhan, which now echoed from the same minaret. But Orhan's vision extended far beyond a simple conversion. He immediately ordered the construction of a kalai, a complex centered around the mosque. Stonemasons, carpenters, and artists were summoned from across the Muslim world. The sounds of construction, the rhythmic tap of hammers, the grating of saws on wood, the shouted instructions of master builders, became the new music of Bursa. A theological school, Madriz*, was built to train the administrators and judges the growing state would need. A public kitchen, *Amaret*, was established where the poor, Muslim and Christian alike, could receive a daily meal. A bathhouse, *Hamam*, offered cleanliness and community. Bursa was transformed from a Byzantine provincial capital into the first true Ottoman capital. It became a center of learning, commerce, and governance. When Orhan died, he was buried there in a simple, elegant tomb, Gumislu Kumbed, that stood in stark contrast to the grandeur he had initiated. The seed of Osman's dream had not only sprouted, it had put down a deep, strong root. The ghost of an empire was beginning to take on solid form. Chapter 2, The Iron Seed, Murad I and the Janissary. The mantle passed to Murad I, a ruler who combined his grandfather's martial vigor with his father's administrative foresight. He was the true engineer of the Ottoman war machine. The existing army was a feudal levy, Turkish cavalrymen, the Sipahis, who held land in exchange for military service. They were brave and effective, but their loyalty was often to their local lords, their beys, rather than to the distant sultan. Murad needed a force that was utterly and exclusively his own. The solution presented itself in the very nature of their expansion. As the Ottomans pushed deeper into the Balkans, they conquered vast territories populated by Christian Slavs, Albanians, and Greeks. The traditional fate of conquered peoples was death, slavery, or conversion. Murad saw a fourth option, one of breathtaking ruthlessness and long-term strategic genius: the divsurm, the gathering, or blood tax. Imagine a scene in a highland village in Serbia. It is a morning in early spring. The mist still clings to the valleys, and the air is crisp. The village is poor, its life dictated by the rhythms of the soil. Suddenly, the tranquility is shattered by the sound of hooves. An Ottoman official, the divsurm officer, rides into the village square, accompanied by a small detachment of stern-looking soldiers. The villagers are herded together, their faces a mask of ancient fear. The officer, holding a scroll, speaks through an interpreter. He has come for the boys. The scene that follows is one of heart-wrenching brutality. All adolescent Christian boys are lined up. The officer moves down the line, a cold-eyed assessor of human potential. He examines their teeth, their bones, the breadth of their shoulders. He looks into their eyes for signs of intelligence and spirit. A measuring rod is used to ensure they are of the right height. The chosen ones are pulled from the line. The air fills with a cacophony of despair. The wails of mothers who know they will never see their sons again. The impotent rage of fathers. The confused terror of the boys themselves. They are given no time for farewells. They are placed on carts or forced to march, cut off in an instant from their language, their faith, their families, their past. It was an institutionalized trauma, a calculated act of cultural severance. But this was not mere slavery. It was a brutal, yet remarkably meritocratic system of recruitment. The boys were brought to Anatolia, converted to Islam, and subjected to a years-long training regime of immense rigor. They were taught Turkish, Arabic, and Persian. They studied the Quran, mathematics, law, and geography. They were trained to exhaustion in archery, horsemanship, and the use of the matchlock musket, a new technology that was changing warfare. The most intellectually gifted were selected for the palace school, destined for the highest offices in the bureaucracy. The strongest and most disciplined were destined for the military. The absolute elite of this elite became the janissary, the new soldiers, the janissaries. They were housed in stark barracks, forbidden to marry in the early centuries, and their sole loyalty was to the Sultan himself. They were his kulu, his slaves. But to be the slave of the Sultan was a position of immense prestige and power. They were paid a regular salary, wore distinct and imposing uniforms. Most famously, the white felt hat called the bork, which symbolized the sleeve of the saint who blessed their order, and marched to the hypnotic, thunderous beat of their own military band, the mater, whose colossal drums and wailing horns struck primal fear into the hearts of their enemies. They were the first standing professional infantry in Europe since the Roman legions. Their discipline was absolute, their morale unbreakable. They became the iron core of the Ottoman army, the sharp tip of the spear. Murad I led this new, terrifying instrument to its first great test. In 1389, a crusading army of Serbs, Bosnians, and Albanians under the command of Prince Lazar Hrebeljanović assembled to stop the Ottoman advance. The two forces met on the field of blackbirds, Kosovo Polj. The battle was a brutal, day-long affair of ferocious cavalry charges and stubborn infantry squares. The Serbian knight Miloš Obilić performed an act that would become the stuff of national legend. Feigning desertion, he managed to fight his way into Murad's tent and stabbed the Sultan to death before being cut down by the royal guards. The scene on the field was one of chaotic, Pyrrhic triumph. The Ottomans, enraged by the death of their father leader, redoubled their efforts and won the day. But the cost was the Sultan himself. As Murad lay dying, his son, Bezid, was immediately proclaimed Sultan on the spot. His first command, delivered with cold-eyed necessity, was the execution of his own brother, Yakub Shalebi, who had also fought bravely in the battle. The reason was simple: to prevent a destructive succession dispute. The message was etched in blood for all future generations. The state, the devlet, was paramount. Individual lives, even those of princes, were expendable for its stability. The tree of Osman would be pruned with a bloody knife to ensure its growth. Bayezid, who had earned the name the Thunderbolt for the speed of his campaigns, now stood at the head of an empire that had lost its founder but was more determined than ever to fulfill his dream. Chapter 3: The Thunderbolt and the Whirlwind. The field of Kosovo was drenched in a silence that was more terrible than the clamor of battle. The air, once thick with the war cries of Serbs and the mater drums of the Ottomans, now hung heavy with the groans of the dying and the scent of blood-soaked earth. Prince Lazar, the Serbian leader, was captured and executed, his nobility no shield against the grim logic of conquest. But the Ottoman victory was ash in their mouths. In the center of the camp, beneath the Sultan's standard, lay Murad, the architect of their might, his lifeblood seeping into the ground from an assassin's wound. Around the body, a tense circle of generals and viziers formed. Their grief was palpable, a raw wound, but beneath it thrummed a more urgent, terrifying emotion: fear. The empire was a young bull, powerful but untested. Without its head, it could easily tear itself apart. All eyes turned to Bayezid, Murad's son. He was a young man, but his face, streaked with dirt and his father's blood, was a mask of grim resolve. He did not weep. He did not cry out. He looked from the lifeless form of his father to the anxious faces of his commanders. His first order was not one of mourning, but of consolidation. Secure the camp. Round up the prisoners. His voice was low, but it carried the weight of command. Then he turned to his most trusted guard. Find my brother, Yakub. Bring him to me. Now, Yakub Shalebi, a capable commander in his own right, was celebrating the victory in another part of the field, unaware of his father's fate. When he was summoned to the Sultan's tent, he likely expected to share in the triumph. Instead, he found his brothers standing over their father's body, the air crackling with danger. The exchange was brief. There was no trial, no deliberation. The law of fratricide, an unwritten but brutally pragmatic code, was invoked. To prevent civil war, to ensure the unity of the devlet, the line of succession must be clean. Yakub was taken outside the tent. The chosen instrument was a silk bowstring, a method deemed fit for royalty, leaving no disfiguring mark. There, on the very field of his victory, Bayezid secured his throne with his brother's life. The thunderbolt had struck, and his reign began not with a coronation, but with a sacrifice. Bayezid Yildirim lived up to his name. He was a force of nature, a whirlwind of military energy. He understood that momentum was everything. In a breathtaking series of campaigns, he swept through the Balkans, subduing Bulgaria, reducing the once proud Byzantine Empire to little more than the city of Constantinople itself, which he blockaded and put under immense pressure. He turned east, absorbing the rival Turkish beyliks of Anatolia with ruthless efficiency. His court was a mobile military camp, his life a perpetual campaign. He was the sword of Osman made flesh, and for a decade, he seemed unstoppable. He even laid siege to Constantinople, the Red Apple, tasting the fruit of his ancestors' dream. But the very speed of his rise created a vortex that drew in a greater storm from the east. Timur the Lame, known to the west as Tamerlane, a Turco-Mongol conqueror of a scale and brutality that dwarfed even the Ottomans. Timur saw Bayezid's burgeoning power in Anatolia as an affront to his own dominion. He was a descendant of Genghis Khan, a man who built pyramids of skulls and laid waste to empires from Delhi to Damascus. He demanded Bayezid's submission. The thunderbolt, flushed with victory, refused with arrogant pride. The two colossal armies met near Ankara in the scorching summer of 1402. The battlefield was a plain of dust and despair. Bayezid's army was a mixed force, his loyal Janissaries and Sipahis at the core, but also recently conquered Turkoman troops whose loyalty was brittle. Timur, a master tactician, understood this. He deployed his greatest weapon, war elephants, monstrous creatures armored in steel, their tusks tipped with blades, their mere presence sowing panic. But his true strategy was psychological. He targeted the Anatolian troops, reminding them of their former allegiances, promising them freedom from Ottoman rule. As the battle raged, the betrayal unfolded. Whole contingents of Bayezid's Anatolian cavalry switched sides or melted away. The Ottoman corps, the Janissaries, fought with their customary discipline, forming a defensive wagon fortress, *Tabor Senji*, and holding against wave after wave of Timurid assaults. But they were isolated. Bayezid, fighting like a lion, was eventually overwhelmed and captured. The legends of his captivity are steeped in symbolic cruelty. It is said that Timur, to humiliate the proud sultan, kept him in an iron cage, parading him like a trophy animal as he continued his campaign. The story goes that Bayezid, the thunderbolt, broken in spirit and body, was forced to watch as his wife, Olivera Despina, a Serbian princess, was made to serve Timur naked at his feasts. The ultimate insult to his honor. Whether the cage is literal or metaphorical, the truth was stark. Bayezid died in captivity in 1403. The empire he had built with such furious energy shattered into fragments as his sons turned their swords on each other in a bloody 11-year civil war known as the Ottoman interregnum. The great tree of Osman, which had grown so tall so fast, seemed to have been felled by a single savage axe blow. Chapter 4. The Patient Gardener. Mehmed I and the Mending. The interregnum was a time of chaos, a dark age where the empire's future hung by a thread. Bayezid's sons, Suleiman, Isa, Musa, and Mehmed, fought a complex, shifting war of alliance and betrayal across the ruined landscape of their inheritance. Territories won with blood were lost overnight. The Byzantine emperor, sensing an opportunity, played the brothers against each other. The Janissaries, the empire's backbone, were divided in their loyalties. Through this turmoil, one son, Mem Shelebi, emerged as the most patient and strategic. He did not possess the thunderous energy of his father, but he had something more valuable for the moment: a cool head and a long-term vision. He understood that the empire could not be reassembled by force alone. It required diplomacy, patience, and the careful rebuilding of trust. He consolidated his power base in Anatolia, biding his time as his brothers exhausted themselves and alienated their supporters. One by one, his rivals fell. Suleiman, who controlled the European territories, grew complacent in Edirne. Musa, who posed a more populist and zealous threat, was defeated after a series of brutal campaigns. Finally, in 1413, Mem stood alone, the sole surviving son of Bayezid with a claim to the throne. He was crowned Sultan Mehmed I in Edirne. His reign was not one of glorious reconquest, but of quiet, painstaking restoration. He was the gardener after the storm, patiently propping up broken branches, clearing away the debris, and tending to the roots. He worked to reconcile the factions that had torn the state apart. He reassured the Janissaries of their privileged position. He reestablished administrative control over the Anatolian beyliks that had slipped away, doing so through a mixture of force and shrewd marriage alliances. He knew that the empire's near-death experience had exposed a fatal flaw: the lack of a clear, uncontested succession law. He began to lay the groundwork for a more stable system, though the brutal practice of fratricide would remain a dark tool of statecraft for centuries to come. Mehmed I died in 1421, not on a battlefield, but in his bed, a sign of the stability he had restored. He left his son, Murad II, a reunited and re-strengthened empire. The work of the patient gardener had been unglamorous, but it was perhaps as vital as any conquest. He had saved a seed of Osman's dream from extinction, allowing it to germinate once more. Chapter 5. The Scholar Warrior, Murad II and the Forging of an Heir. Murad II was a ruler of two worlds. On one hand, he was a formidable military leader, forced to spend much of his reign on campaign to crush revolts in the Balkans and confront a new, powerful enemy, the Hungarians, led by the brilliant and fervent John Hunyadi. He suffered defeats, most notably at the hands of Hunyadi, but he also won decisive victories, cementing Ottoman control on the Balkans. He was a capable successor to his father's work of consolidation. But Murad's heart lay elsewhere. He was a man of deep intellectual and mystical curiosity. He found solace not in the clamor of war, but in the quiet of the study and the ecstatic rituals of Sufi dervishes. He composed poetry under the pen name Muradi. He sponsored scholars and artists, transforming Edirne into a center of culture. He was, in many ways, a man who would have been content with a life of contemplation. This duality shaped his most important decision: the upbringing of his son, Mehmed. The boy was intelligent, precocious, and fiercely willed. Murad, perhaps seeing his own spiritual inclinations in the child, ensured he received an education unlike any Ottoman prince before him. Mehmed was tutored by some of the greatest minds of the age, including a renowned scholar, named Molla Gurani, who was said to have disciplined the stubborn prince into a love of learning. He studied the Quran and Islamic law, but also mathematics, astronomy, and philosophy. Most significantly, he was taught languages: Turkish, Arabic, Persian, and, crucially, Greek and Latin. Murad introduced him to the classics. The boy devoured the histories of Alexander the Great, of Julius Caesar, of the Roman and Persian emperors. He was not raised solely on the Ghazi tradition of holy war. He was immersed in the concept of universal empire, of a Caesar of Rome, who could unite East and West. This education planted a seed of destiny in Mehmed that would far exceed the ambitions of his ancestors. In 1444, exhausted by the burdens of rule and yearning for a life of devotion, Murad II did the unthinkable. He abdicated in favor of his 12-year-old son, Mehmed, and retired to Manisa for a life of spiritual retreat. The reaction was immediate and predictable. Christendom, seeing a child on the throne, launched a massive crusade, the Varna Crusade, led by the formidable Hunyadi. The Ottoman state was thrown into panic. The vizier sent desperate pleas to Murad. "The state is in peril. You cannot abandon it." Reluctantly, the retired sultan returned. At the Battle of Varna, he took command. The battle was a close-run thing, but the Ottomans prevailed, and the Christian king, the Ladislaw III of Poland and Hungary, was killed on the field. His head was sent to the court of the Ottoman ally, the Karamanid ruler, as a grisly trophy. Murad returned to the throne, his retirement over. This episode was a crucial lesson for the young Mehmed, who had been sidelined during the crisis. He saw the fragility of power, the ruthlessness of enemies, and the weight of responsibility. He also felt the humiliation of being supplanted by his father. When Murad II died peacefully in 1451, Mehmed II ascended the throne for the second time. He was 19 years old. He was no longer a boy prince. He was a scholar, a warrior, and a man consumed by a single, all-encompassing purpose, a purpose born for his father's books and his ancestors' dream: to take the city that had defied them for a century and a half. Constantinople, the red apple was ripe, and a new conqueror was ready to pluck it. Chapter 6: The Red Apple, the Siege of Constantinople. The news of Murad II's death in 1451 was met with a profound, watchful silence in the courts of Europe. In Constantinople, the aging Emperor Constantine XI Palaiologos, the last in a line of Caesars stretching back to Augustus, felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter wind blowing off the Golden Horn. He knew the young sultan, who now sat on the throne in Edirne, was not like his contemplative father. Constantine dispatched ambassadors to Mehmed, bearing gifts and reaffirming the peace treaties. Mehmed received them with cool courtesy. He confirmed the treaties, swearing on the Quran to uphold them. But his eyes, dark and intense, betrayed a different promise. Mehmed's first act was not one of peace, but of deliberate, calculated provocation. On the European side of the Bosporus, directly across from the Anatolian fortress built by his great-grandfather, he ordered the construction of a colossal new fortress, Rumeli Hizuri, the Straight Cutter. He personally designed its layout, pacing the ground, insisting the 3 great towers be named for his 3 chief viziers, ensuring their personal investment. The air rang with the sound of thousands of masons and laborers. Quarries were stripped bare. The Byzantine ambassadors protested. This was a violation of their territory, an act of war. Mehmet coldly replied that the land was his by right. He was not building a fortress. He was closing a lock. The noose was being tied. Within the walls of Constantinople, a desperate, grim resolve took hold. The city was a ghost of its former glory. Where 1 million people had once thronged its broad avenues, now perhaps 50,000 lived, huddled in villages separated by fields and ruins. The great aqueducts were broken. The Theodosian walls, though still mighty, required constant repair. Constantine XI, a good and brave man facing an impossible task, worked tirelessly. He appealed to the West, to Pope Nicholas V. But the schism between the Eastern Orthodox and Roman Catholic churches ran deep. The price of aid was submission to the Pope. When a union of the churches was finally, reluctantly proclaimed in the Hagia Sophia, it caused riots in the city. The very people Constantine was trying to save saw him as a traitor to their faith. The West sent a paltry force, 700 soldiers under the Genoese condottiero, Giovanni Giustiniani Longo, a man whose skill and courage would become legendary. Mehmed's preparations were meticulous, terrifying in their scale. He assembled an army of over 100,000 men, including 12,000 elite janissaries. But his masterstroke was technological. He sought out a Hungarian Christian engineer named Orban, a man who had offered his services to the Byzantines, who had been too poor to afford him. Orban told Mehmed he could build a cannon that could shatter the walls of Babylon itself. Mehmed gave him unlimited funds. The result was a monster. The Great Bronze Cannon, later named Basilica, was 27 feet long, with walls 8 inches thick. It fired a stone ball weighing over 1,200 pounds. Transporting it from Edirne required 60 oxen and 400 men to steady it on a specially built carriage. It was a symbol of a new age, the age of gunpowder, and Mehmed was its prophet. In early April 1453, the Ottoman army appeared before the walls. The sight was enough to freeze the blood of the defenders. A sea of tents, flags, and men stretched from the Sea of Marmara to the Golden Horn. The great chain, forged of massive wooden links buoyed by barrels, was stretched across the entrance to the Golden Horn, blocking the Ottoman fleet and protecting the vulnerable northern sea walls. The siege began with the roar of Orban's cannon. The sound was not a mere noise. It was a physical force, a blow to the chest that could be heard for miles. The first massive stone ball soared through the air in a high, lazy arc before crashing against the walls near the Romanus Gate. The impact was not a crack, but a deep, sickening thud that sent a shower of marble and mortar flying. The very earth trembled. For weeks, the cannonade was relentless. The outer walls were pounded into rubble. Each night, under cover of darkness, the defenders, led by Giustiniani and Constantine himself, would desperately rebuild the breaches with wooden palisades, barrels of earth, and anything they could find. It was a race between destruction and repair. The Ottoman troops launched wave after wave of assaults, only to be beaten back by the determined defenders. The narrow breaches became slaughterhouses, where the discipline of the Janissaries met the desperate courage of the Greeks and Italians. The stalemate was broken by Mehmed's genius. The chain blocking the Golden Horn was impregnable. So, Mehmed decided to go over it. In one of the most audacious logistical feats in military history, he ordered a fleet of some 70 ships to be dragged on greased wooden rollers from the Bosporus, over the hill behind the Genoese colony of Galata, and down into the Golden Horn. They built a road of logs, using oxen and teams of men. On the morning of April 22nd, the defenders on the sea walls woke to a sight that defied belief. The Ottoman fleet was inside their protected inlet. The city was now besieged from all sides. Morale plummeted. Mehmed offered terms. He promised Constantine and the inhabitants safe passage and the preservation of their property if they surrendered. Constantine refused. To surrender the city is beyond my authority and beyond anyone else's who lives in it, he declared. For by the common decision of all, we are resolved to die of our own free will, without any regard for our lives. The final assault began in the early hours of May 29th. Mehmed threw his irregulars, the Bashibazuks, at the walls first. They were cut down in droves, but they exhausted the defenders. Next came the Anatolian troops, better disciplined, who fought their way onto the rubble of the outer walls. The fighting was ferocious, hand to hand in the dark, illuminated by flashes of cannon and gunfire. The critical moment came near the Romanus Gate, where Justiniani was commanding. A stray Ottoman arrow or arquebus shot found a gap in his armor, wounding him severely. The great Genoese commander, the Rock of the Defense, asked to be carried from the walls. His men, seeing their leader fall, lost heart and began to waver. At this precise moment, from the Ottoman lines, a cry went up. "The city is ours." A small postern gate, the Kirka Porta, had been left open, either by oversight or treachery. A group of Janissaries, led by a giant named Hassan, surged through. They raised the Ottoman banner on a tower. The sight was electric. The Janissaries poured into the breach with renewed fury. The defense collapsed. Emperor Constantine XI, seeing the end had come, tore off his imperial purple regalia so as not to be identified. Drawing his sword, he cried out, "The city is taken, and I am still alive." He then charged into the oncoming tide of Janissaries, into the chaos and the smoke, and was swallowed up. The last Roman emperor died as his empire ended. Fighting, anonymous, his body never found. The city was given over to 3 days of plunder, as promised. The scenes were of unimaginable horror and brutality. But as the sun rose on the third day, Mehmed II entered his new capital. He rode through the streets of carnage and destruction, his face impassive. He went directly to the Hagia Sophia, the greatest church in Christendom, where the terrified populace had gathered for a last, futile prayer. He dismounted, stooped, and picked up a handful of earth, which he sprinkled on his turban in an act of humility before God. He entered the vast, echoing space, its mosaics of Christ and the emperors looking down. He stopped a soldier who was hacking at the marble floor with his sword. "Enough," he said. "The loot is yours. The buildings are mine." He then ascended the pulpit and recited the Shahada. "There is no God but Allah, and Muhammad is his messenger." The great cathedral became a mosque. The sound of the Christian liturgy, sung in that space for 916 years, was silenced, replaced by Adzan, the call to prayer. He was now Fatih the Conqueror. He had fulfilled the dream of Osman. He had taken a red apple, and he took a new title, Caesar of Rome. The Ottoman Empire was no longer a powerful Turkish state. It was now the heir to the Roman world. The center of gravity had shifted irrevocably. The tree of Osman now cast its shadow over the city at the center of the world. Chapter 7. The Architect of an Imperial Capital, Mehmed the Conqueror's Rule. The silence that settled over Constantinople after the 3 days of pillage was a profound, eerie thing. The city, which had echoed with the cacophony of battle, now held only the whispers of the wind through shattered doors, the distant cries of gulls, and the low murmurs of the conquering army. The smell of smoke and blood hung heavy in the air. Mehmed II, now Fatih, walked through the desolation not as a destroyer, but as a builder surveying a new foundation. The dream of possession was over. The greater, more arduous dream of creation was about to begin. His first act was one of psychological mastery. He understood that a city of ghosts could not be a capital. He issued a decree calling for the return of those who had fled and, more importantly, inviting or compelling people from all corners of his empire to resettle the empty spaces. Muslims, Christians, and Jews from Anatolia and the Balkans were brought in. He granted them homes, tax incentives, and a remarkable degree of religious autonomy. The Greek Orthodox Patriarchate was re-established, with Gennadius Scholarius, a prominent intellectual who had opposed the union with Rome, installed as patriarch. Mehmed himself, in a solemn ceremony, handed Gennadius the ceremonial staff of office, confirming his authority over the entire Orthodox Christian community within the empire. This act formalized the millet system, making the patriarch both a religious leader and a political administrator responsible to the sultan. It was a stroke of genius. He gave the conquered population a stake in the new order. But his vision was not merely to repopulate. It was to rebuild and surpass. The Topkapi Palace, the Cannon Gate Palace, began to rise on the Seraglio Point, the very acropolis of the ancient city. This was not a single building, but a sprawling complex of courtyards, pavilions, and gardens, designed not for vulgar display, but as the efficient, secluded heart of government. Its very layout was a symbol of the new state philosophy, a series of gates leading deeper inward, from the public courtyards where state business was conducted to the private, forbidden inner sanctums of the sultan's personal life. The harem, which would later become a byword for decadent intrigue, was initially a modest quarter for the royal family, but its placement at the very core of power was telling. The state was becoming personal, dynastic, and increasingly secluded. Mehmed was also a patron of learning on a colossal scale. Throughout the city, he commissioned madrasas, theological schools, 8 of them built around the great mosque he constructed, the Fatima complex, which rose on the site of the ruined Church of the Holy Apostles. These were not simple religious schools. They were universities, attracting the greatest minds of the Muslim world. Libraries were founded, filled with manuscripts looted from Constantinople's monasteries and collected from across the known world. The Sultan's own passion for knowledge was insatiable. He kept a personal diary, wrote poetry, and assembled a library of Greek and Latin classics, often having them translated into Turkish or Arabic. He surrounded himself with humanist scholars from Italy, engaging them in debates on philosophy and geography. He was, in many ways, a Renaissance prince sitting on the throne of the Caesars. Yet, the scholar was always tempered by the warrior. The conquest of Constantinople was not an end, but a beginning. He spent the next 3 decades in an unending cycle of campaign and consolidation. His armies swept through the Peloponnese, subjugating the last remnants of the Byzantine Empire. They pushed north into the Balkans, crushing the Serbian despotate and reducing Bosnia to a province. In Anatolia, he extinguished the last independent Turkish beylik, the Karamanids, finally unifying the peninsula under Ottoman rule. His fleet, born from the galleys that had been dragged overland, became the master of the Aegean and the Black Sea. The Genoese trading colony of Kaffa in the Crimea fell, giving the Ottomans control of the vital slave and grain routes from the north. One of his most poignant campaigns was against the small, rocky island of Lesbos. The reason was not purely strategic, it was personal. The island's ruler had given refuge to a pretender to the Ottoman throne, a man claiming to be Mehmed's long-lost brother. After a siege, the island capitulated. The story goes that Mehmed, walking through the captured capital, came across a beautiful young woman, the daughter of a nobleman. Her name was Maria. Struck by her grace and learning, he took her into his household. She would convert to Islam, take the name Gulbahar, and become the mother of his successor, Bayezid. Even in war, the threads of the empire's future were being woven. Mehmed's final years were marked by a grand, overarching ambition to conquer Rome itself, to truly become the Caesar of the West. In 1480, his forces landed in Italy and captured the city of Otranto, turning its cathedral into a mosque. Panic swept through Europe. The Pope prepared to flee the Vatican, but the campaign was cut short. In the spring of 1481, as he prepared to lead his army on a new, grand campaign, destination unknown, but rumored to be either Rhodes or a push north from Otranto, Mehmed fell ill. The nature of the illness is shrouded in mystery. Some accounts speak of gout or colic, worsened by his immense size in his later years. Others whisper of poison, administered by his Italian doctor at the behest of his son, Bezid, who feared his father's favor was turning toward his more militantly ambitious half-brother, Sem. He died on May 3, 1481, at the age of 49. His death was kept secret for days to prevent unrest in the army. When the news finally broke, the reaction in Europe was one of jubilation. Church bells rang out in celebration. The feared Grand Turk, the man who had ended the Roman Empire and threatened Christendom's very heart, was gone. He left behind a transformed world. He had taken a regional power and forged it into a world empire. He had turned a ruined city into a magnificent imperial capital. He was a complex, contradictory figure, a ruthless conqueror who cherished art and poetry, a devout Muslim who employed Christian generals and debated with humanist scholars, a man of immense personal appetites and profound intellectual curiosity. He was the true architect of the Ottoman imperial system. The seed planted by Osman had, under Mehmed the Conqueror, grown into a mighty and terrifying tree, its branches now casting a long shadow over both Europe and Asia. Chapter 8. The Saint and the Shadow, the Reign of Bayezid II. The death of the conqueror created a vacuum that threatened to tear the empire apart. The great cannon that had shattered the walls of Constantinople was now cold. In the sprawling, silent chambers of the Topkapi Palace, the only sound was the whisper of conspiracy. Mehmed had left two sons. The elder, Bezid, governor of Amazia, a man known for his piety and moderation, and the younger, Sem, governor of Konya, brilliant, ambitious, and his father's favorite in matters of war. The news of Mehmed's death was a spark in a powder keg. The Grand Vizier, Kahramani Mehmed Pasha, hoping to secure his own power, moved with ruthless speed. He sent messengers to Prince Sem, but he also sent a secret order to the Janissaries in the capital, urging them to support Bayezid. He knew that Janissaries, the backbone of the state, favored the elder prince's stability over the younger's fiery ambition. But the vizier had misjudged the loyalty of the corps. When the Janissaries gathered in the palace courtyard, their white bork hats creating a sea of ominous silence, they did not call for Bayezid. They demanded to see the body of their sultan. They suspected treachery. When the Grand Vizier hesitated, the tension snapped. The Janissaries, in a sudden, terrifying surge of violence, stormed the divan. Kahramani Mehmed Pasha was seized, dragged into the courtyard, and torn to pieces. His head was placed on a pike, a grim reminder of who truly held power in the moments between sultans. Amidst this chaos, a ship sailed with desperate speed across the Black Sea. It carried the message to Bayezid: "Your father is dead. The throne is yours if you can take it." Bayezid, a thoughtful, almost scholarly man, understood the language of power. He did not march with a great army. He moved with a small, swift retinue, knowing that speed now was worth more than force. As he traveled, his supporters in the capital worked to secure the loyalty of the key factions. By the time Bayezid reached Istanbul, the path was clear. He was acclaimed as Sultan Bayezid II, but his reign began under a long, dark shadow. His brother, Sem, had also been proclaimed Sultan in Anatolia. The empire was plunged into a civil war that echoed the disastrous interregnum. The two brothers' armies met at the Battle of Yenisei. Bayezid's forces, better supplied and backed by the state apparatus, were victorious. Sem, defeated but not broken, became a ghost that would haunt Bayezid's every waking moment. He fled, first to the Mamluk Sultanate of Egypt, then to the one place that would welcome an Ottoman pretender, the island of Rhodes, stronghold of the Knights Hospitaller. The Grand Master of the Knights, Pierre d'Aubusson, was a master of realpolitik. He saw Sim not as a guest, but as a pawn of immense value. He offered Sim sanctuary, but it was the sanctuary of a gilded cage. From that moment on, Sim's sultan became a weapon in the hands of Christendom. Bayezid II, the sultan of the most powerful empire in the Muslim world, was forced to pay a massive annual tribute to the Knights of Rhodes to keep his brother imprisoned. It was a humiliating ransom, a state secret that festered like a hidden wound. Worse, European monarchs, the King of Naples, the Pope, even the King of France, would periodically take custody of Sim, each using the threat of releasing him to launch a crusade to extract concessions from Bayezid. The Sultan in Istanbul ruled with one eye always looking over his shoulder towards the west, where his brother lived as a perpetual living threat. This shadow dictated the character of Bayezid's reign. Where his father had been a conqueror, Bayezid was a consolidator. Where Mehmed had been audacious, Bayezid was cautious. He was a deeply pious man, earning the nickname Veli, the saint. He reversed many of his father's more secular policies, pouring wealth into the construction of mosques, theological schools, and Sufi lodges. He patronized Islamic law and looked with suspicion upon the humanist scholars and artists his father had adored. The vibrant, cosmopolitan court of Mehmed grew more insular, more orthodox. Yet, Bayezid's piety was not weakness. It was a different kind of strength. He focused inward on the infrastructure of the empire. He built immense mosque complexes in Istanbul and Edirne, not just as places of worship, but as social engines that included hospitals, soup kitchens, and caravanserais. His reign saw a flowering of Ottoman architecture, a style that began to find its own voice, moving beyond the Byzantine influences of Mehmed's time. He was a just ruler, known for his concern for the common people, and his reign was a time of relative peace and economic stability for the core of the empire. But the world does not reward caution. While Bayezid focused on internal development and knew terrifying power was rising in the east. In Persia, a mystical Sufi order led by Shah Ismail had coalesced into a militant political force, the Safavid Empire. Ismail was a charismatic leader who proclaimed himself the Mahdi and champion of Shia Islam. His followers, the Kizilbash, or redheads for their distinctive crimson headgear, were fanatically loyal. Safavid missionaries and agents began to infiltrate Anatolia, preaching their message to the Turkoman tribes, whose loyalty to the distant Ottoman Sultan was often tenuous. A spiritual wildfire was spreading along the empire's eastern frontier, threatening to burn it from within. Bayezid, the man of peace, was ill-equipped to face this zealous new threat. He sent armies, but they were defeated. He tried diplomacy, but Ismail was a revolutionary, not a diplomat. The Ottoman elite, particularly the military, grew restless. They saw their sultan as weak, his piety as passivity. They looked instead to his sons, particularly the governor of the Balkan province of Trabzon, a man known for his iron will, his military genius, and his ruthless ambition, Prince Selim. Selim watched his father's struggles with the Safavids with mounting fury. He saw the Kizilbash unrest not as a problem to be managed, but as a heresy to be crushed. He began to gather his own power base, clashing with his father's governors. Finally, in 1511, a massive pro-Safavid rebellion led by a charismatic preacher named Shakalu erupted in Anatolia, plunging the region into chaos. Bayezid's army, led by his Grand Vizier, was ambushed and destroyed. The vizier was killed. The rebellion was eventually put down, but the empire was shaken to its core. Selim saw his moment. He marched an army from Trabzon towards Istanbul, not to defend it, but to seize it. Father and son faced each other outside the capital. Bayezid, old, sick, and heartbroken, had no stomach for a war against his own child. He agreed to abdicate. The transfer of power was meant to be peaceful, but the shadows of the Ottoman succession were rarely dispelled so easily. Just a month later, as he was departing the capital for a retirement in his native Dimatoka, Bayezid too died. The official cause was natural, given his age and ill health. But the whispers were immediate and persistent, that he had been poisoned on the orders of his son, Selim. The reign of the saint was over. The shadow of the brother, Sem, had finally lifted, only to be replaced by the far darker, more formidable shadow of the sun. The age of caution was dead. The age of the grim was about to begin. Chapter 9. The Scourge of God, Selim I and the Sword of Islam. The air in the throne room of Topkapi was thick with the scent of fear and old incense. Bayezid the saint was gone, his gentle spirit replaced by a chilling void. On May 24th, 1512, his son Selim ascended the throne. He was not a tall man, but his presence was immense, filling the vast chamber. His face, framed by a sharp, black beard, was a mask of grim resolve. His eyes, dark and piercing, scanned the assembled viziers, pashas, and religious leaders. There was no joy in this coronation, only a sense of grim necessity. The empire was soft, rotting from within. Selim had not come to rule. He had come to purify. His first act was not one of consolidation, but of annihilation. The Ottoman tradition of fratricide was a brutal but established tool of statecraft. Selim wielded it with a comprehensiveness that shocked even his hardened contemporaries. His father's peaceful reign had allowed his brothers and their sons to flourish. They were potential foci for rebellion, seeds of future civil war. Selim would not allow a single seed to sprout. A systematic purge began. His brothers, Korkut and Ahmed, were hunted down. Ahmed, a popular and capable prince, was defeated in battle, captured, and executed. His sons, Selim's own nephews, were sought out and strangled with the silk bowstring reserved for royalty. The order was carried out with a cold efficiency that left the court trembling. The message was clear. This sultan would tolerate no rival, no sentiment, no weakness. He earned his epithet not from his enemies, but from his own family. Yavuz, the grim, the stern, the inflexible. With the internal threat extinguished, Selim turned his gaze east. The real enemy was not his blood, but the heresy of Shah Ismail of Persia. Ismail's Safavid empire was more than a political rival. It was a spiritual cancer. Kizilbash missionaries had been poisoning the minds of the Anatolian Turkomans, turning them against their Sunni Ottoman rulers. For Selim, this was not a border dispute. It was a holy war, a battle for the very soul of Islam. He prepared for war with a focus that bordered on obsession. He passed new laws, persecuting Shia Muslims within his borders, branding them as fifth columnists. His propaganda machine portrayed Ismail not as a king, but as a false prophet, a demonic figure. In 1514, Selim led his army east, a force of over 100,000 men, including 12,000 elite janissaries. The campaign was a nightmare march through the harsh Anatolian plateau. Shah Ismail, employing a scorched earth policy, left nothing for the Ottoman army to forage. The soldiers suffered from hunger and thirst. Morale plummeted. The Janissaries, resentful of this long campaign far from home, grumbled ominously. Salim's response was typical. When a delegation of Janissary officers came to complain, he had them executed on the spot for insubordination. He would drive his army to victory or to death. The two forces finally met at Calderon, on a flat plain in northwestern Persia, on August 23, 1514. Ismail's army was smaller, but its Kizilbash cavalry were legendary for their fanatical charges. They were masters of the swift, swirling attack, the Tolgama, designed to envelop and destroy. Salim, however, was a master of a new kind of warfare. He formed a defensive wagon fortress, a tabor senji, chaining cannons and carts together to create a fortified laager. Behind this barrier, he placed his Janissaries, armed with matchlock muskets. The battle began with a thunderous Kizilbash charge. It was a magnificent, terrifying sight. Thousands of horsemen, their red headgear blazing in the sun, screaming Ismail's name, hurling themselves at the Ottoman line. They crashed against the wagon fortress, and there they were slaughtered. The Ottoman cannons fired grapeshot, scything through the packed ranks of cavalry. The Janissaries, disciplined and protected, fired volley after volley of musket fire into the chaos. The Kizilbash courage was useless against the grim, industrial efficiency of Salim's army. The battle was a decisive Ottoman victory. Shah Ismail himself was wounded and barely escaped. Salim entered the Persian capital of Tabriz in triumph. But Calderon was not an end. It was a prelude. Salim's true destiny lay not in Persia, but to the south. The ancient Mamluk Sultanate, which ruled Egypt, Syria, and the holy cities of Mecca and Medina, was the traditional leader of the Sunni Muslim world. But the Mamluks were a decaying relic, a military caste grown complacent. They had dared to give shelter to Salim's fugitive nephews. For Yavuz Salim, this was an insult that could only be washed away in blood. In 1516, he turned his army south. The Mamluks, led by their aged Sultan Kansa al-Ghori, marched out to meet him at Marj Dabik, north of Aleppo. The battle was a repeat of Calderon. The Mamluk cavalry, the finest in the world a century before, charged with magnificent bravery. But they were knights in a gunpowder age. The Ottoman artillery and Janissary musketry decimated them. Sultan al-Ghori died on the field, some say of a stroke, others of a broken heart. The Mamluk Empire crumbled in a day. Salim marched unopposed into Damascus, then into Jerusalem, where he prayed at the Al-Aqsa Mosque. The final act came in 1517. At the Battle of Rodania, just outside Cairo, Salim outflanked the Mamluk defenses, using a daring night march through the desert to attack from the rear. The last Mamluk Sultan, Tuman Bey, fought bravely, but was captured and hanged from the gates of Cairo. The Mamluk Sultanate was erased from the map. But Salim's greatest prize was not territorial. In Cairo resided the last shadow of the Abbasid Caliphate, Al-Mutawakkil III. The Caliphate was a hollow title, but it held immense symbolic power as the leadership of the entire Muslim community. In a ceremony of profound historical significance, Al-Mutawakkil III formally transferred the title of Caliph to Salim and his descendants. The keys to the holy cities of Mecca and Medina were handed over. The sacred relics of the Prophet Muhammad, his cloak and banner, were sent to Istanbul. Salim had achieved in 8 years what his ancestors had not in 2 centuries. He had doubled the size of the empire. He had crushed the Shia heresy in the east. He had destroyed the Sunni rival in the south. And he had taken for himself the ultimate spiritual authority in Islam. The Ottoman Sultan was now the Caliph, the defender of the faithful, the undisputed master of the Sunni world. He returned to Istanbul not as a conqueror, but as an emperor who had reshaped the world. But the fire that drove him had burned too fiercely. In September 1520, while preparing for a new campaign, likely against the Knights of Rhodes, he contracted a virulent disease, possibly anthrax. The man of iron was felled by an invisible speck. He died near Corlu, his body brought back to his capital. He was buried in a courtyard behind a mosque he had begun to build, a simple, powerful tomb for the most formidable of the Ottoman sultans. He left his son, Suleiman, an empire of staggering size and power, a unified faith, and a title that echoed across the centuries, Caliph. The Grimm had forged an empire of steel and scripture. Now it was time for the magnificent to gild it. Chapter 10. The Golden Cage, the Magnificent Century of Suleiman. The news of Selim's death spread through the capital like a sigh of release. The grim sultan was gone. The streets, which had been so tense under his iron rule, began to buzz with a nervous anticipation. On September 30th, 1520, his only surviving son, Suleiman, aged 25, ascended the throne. There was no bloody succession struggle. Selim's purges had seen to that. The court, the army, the people, all turned their eyes to the new sultan, wondering what kind of ruler would emerge from the shadow of his terrifying father. They need not have worried. Suleiman was everything his father was not. Where Selim was harsh, Suleiman was dignified. Where Selim was a scourge, Suleiman saw himself as a benefactor. He was tall, handsome, with a calm and commanding presence. He had been meticulously educated in the palace school, a master of statecraft, literature, and theology. He was also a skilled goldsmith, a passion that spoke to his love of beauty and order. His reign would be remembered as the Golden Age, the Magnificent Century, and he would be known to his people as Kinyuni, the lawgiver, and to the West as Suleiman the Magnificent. His first acts were deliberate and symbolic. He ordered the release of hundreds of Egyptian and Persian captives his father had taken, sending them home with gifts. He distributed vast sums of charity to the poor. He showered the janissaries with a lavish accession bonus. It was a calculated display of generosity, a signal that the time of the sword was to be balanced by the time of the scroll. But the sword was not sheathed for long. Suleiman understood that an empire must expand or stagnate. His gaze fell first on the Christian stronghold of Belgrade, the gateway to Hungary. In 1521, he led a massive army north and laid siege to the city. The capture of Belgrade was a masterclass in military engineering. Ottoman sappers dug tunnels under the formidable walls, collapsing them with explosives. The city fell, and with it, the path to the heart of Europe was flung open. The next target was the island fortress of Rhodes, home to the Knights of St. John, the very order that had held his great-uncle Sem captive. For Suleiman, this was a matter of dynasty and honor. The siege of Rhodes in 1522 was one of the most epic in military history. The Knights, under Grand Master Philippe Villiers de l'Isle-Adam, defended their massive walls with legendary tenacity. For 5 months, the Ottomans bombarded and assaulted, suffering horrific casualties. Finally, with the defenders on the brink of annihilation, de l'Isle-Adam negotiated an honorable surrender. Suleiman, impressed by their courage, allowed the surviving knights to depart with their arms and relics. It was a chivalrous act that burnished his reputation in Europe. The Ottoman flag now flew over the eastern Mediterranean. These conquests were the backdrop to the true glory of Suleiman's reign, the cultural and legal flourishing within the empire. Istanbul was transformed into the most magnificent city in the world. And the artist of this transformation was a man named Sinan, a former Janissary conscripted through the Divserm. Sinan was a genius of stone and space. Suleiman recognized his talent and appointed him chief imperial architect. For decades, Sinan's cranes and scaffolds dominated the skyline. He studied the great Hagia Sophia, not to copy it, but to surpass it. His masterpiece, the Suleimani Mosque complex, was more than a place of worship. It was a city within a city, with its 4 slender minarets piercing the sky, its vast domes seeming to float on a cascade of light from hundreds of windows. Surrounding were schools, a hospital, a public kitchen, a library, and a bathhouse. It was the physical embodiment of Suleiman's vision, a state that provided order, justice, and beauty for its people. Suleiman's own passion was law. He spent years presiding over the imperial council, personally reforming and codifying the entire legal system of the empire. His canonames, or law codes, standardized criminal law, land tenure, and taxation, creating a framework of justice that applied to all, from the highest pasha to the lowest peasant. This earned him his title, Kanuni, and established a legacy of bureaucratic order that would long outlive him. Yet, within this golden age, a personal drama of immense consequence was unfolding in the very heart of the palace, in the harem. The harem was not just a pleasure palace. It was a separate, intricate world of hundreds of women, concubines, servants, eunuchs, and a hotbed of political intrigue. Suleiman's great love was a woman who would shatter its traditions. She was a concubine from Ruthenia, modern Ukraine, known as Hurrem, the Laughing One. Intelligent, ambitious, and captivating, Hurrem achieved the unthinkable. She persuaded Suleiman to marry her, making her his legal wife, a status no concubine had held for centuries. She bore him several children, including his favorite son, Selim. Hurrem's rise threatened the most powerful man in the empire after the Sultan, the Grand Vizier, Pergali Ibrahim Pasha. Ibrahim was Suleiman's childhood friend, a Greek Divserm who had risen to become the Sultan's most trusted companion and brother-in-law. For 13 years, he was the brilliant administrator of the empire, a patron of the arts, and a successful military commander. But Hurrem, from her apartments in the harem, saw him as a rival for Suleiman's ear and a supporter of another prince, the talented and popular Mustafa, son of another concubine. The downfall of Ibrahim Pasha was a slow, tragic poison. Hurrem, through whispers and cunning, planted seeds of doubt in Suleiman's mind. She suggested Ibrahim was growing too powerful, too arrogant, that he saw himself as an equal to the Sultan. The absolute trust between the two men began to erode. In 1536, after a victorious campaign against Persia, Ibrahim was at the height of his power. He was summoned to a banquet in the Topkapi Palace. After the feast, he retired to his private chambers. In the dead of night, the Sultan's mute executioners entered. Ibrahim, awakened, fought for his life, but was overpowered and strangled. His body was dumped unceremoniously. Suleiman, the lawgiver, had ordered the death of his closest friend. The court was stunned. It was a stark reminder that in the golden cage of power, no one, not even the magnificent, was safe from the Sultan's suspicion. The latter part of Suleiman's reign was dominated by his rivalry with the Habsburgs, particularly Emperor Charles V. This was a clash of universal empires, of Christianity and Islam. The Ottoman fleet, under the command of the brilliant Admiral Nureddin Barbarossa, a pirate king who became Capitan Pasha, made the Mediterranean an Ottoman lake. They raided the coasts of Italy and Spain, battling the fleets of Charles V and the Knights of Malta. On land, Suleiman led his armies deep into Europe. In 1526, he annihilated the Hungarian army at the Battle of Mohacs, a catastrophe so complete that the Hungarian kingdom ceased to exist. The young King Louis II of Hungary drowned in a stream while fleeing. Suleiman was said to have gazed upon the field of the dead and murmured a verse of melancholy. He pushed on to the ultimate prize, Vienna, the heart of the Habsburg domain. The siege of Vienna in 1529, however, was a failure. The weather turned, the rains came, and the stout defenses, combined with the overstretched Ottoman supply lines, forced a retreat. It was the high-water mark of Ottoman expansion in Europe. Suleiman grew old. The golden youth was now a man weighed down by gout, the deaths of loved ones, including Hurrem, and the constant wars. His sons were dead, except for the indolent Selim and the ambitious Bayezid. The old tragedy repeated itself. Believing his son Mustafa was plotting against him, Suleiman gave the order for his execution. The talented prince was strangled by mutes as he pleaded his innocence to his father in an adjacent tent. Later, a civil war erupted between Selim and Bayezid. Suleiman backed Selim. Bayezid was defeated, fled to Persia, and was eventually executed there on Suleiman's demand. His body returned to Istanbul in a coffin. In 1566, at the age of 72, Suleiman embarked on his 13th and final military campaign. Once again, he marched against Hungary. His body was so racked with illness, he had to be carried in a litter. The target was the fortress of Sigidvar, a relatively minor obstacle. But its defender, the Croatian-Hungarian Count Nikola Subik-Zrinski, refused to surrender. The siege dragged on. On the night before the final, decisive assault, September 5, 1566, Suleiman the Magnificent, the lawgiver, the caliph, died in his tent. His heart had simply given out. His death was kept secret for 48 days to prevent panic in the army and allow his son Selim to reach the capital. The Grand Vizier conducted the war council as if the Sultan were still alive, issuing orders from behind curtain. The fortress was taken in a final suicidal charge by Zrinski and his men. Only then was the truth revealed. Suleiman's body was embalmed and carried back to Istanbul. He was buried in a tomb in the courtyard of his great Suleimani Mosque next to Hurrem. His reign of 46 years was the longest and most glorious in Ottoman history. He had taken the empire forged by his father to its absolute zenith of power, wealth, and cultural achievement. But as his funeral procession wound its way through the silent, grieving streets of his capital, a question hung in the air, heavier than any stone dome. Who could possibly maintain the glory of the magnificent century? The golden age was over. The long, slow sunset was about to begin. Chapter 11. The Sultanate of Women, Shadows in the Golden Cage. The silence that fell over the empire after Suleiman's death was not one of peace, but of held breath. The magnificent century had ended not with a bang, but with the slow, sad creak of a litter carrying a dead emperor home. His successor, Selim II, was a man the courtiers called Sari Selim, Selim the Sallow, or more cruelly, Sarho Selim, Selim the Drunk. He was a stark contrast to his father. Where Suleiman had been a warrior scholar, Selim's passions were for the pleasures of the palace, wine, poetry, and the exquisite confines of the harem. He had no desire to lead armies. On the day of his accession, he is said to have sighed with relief and declared, "Now, we may rest." This abdication of active rule did not create a vacuum of power. It created an opportunity. The center of gravity in the Ottoman Empire shifted from the throne room to the harem. This was the beginning of the Kadimler Sultanate, the Sultanate of women. For nearly a century, the most powerful figures in the empire would be not the sultans, but their mothers, the Valide sultans, and their favorite consorts. The architect of this new order was a woman of extraordinary intelligence and ruthlessness, Hurrem Sultan. Though she died before Suleiman, her legacy had secured the throne for her son, Selim, and established the harem as a political force. But the true master of the era was Selim's own favorite, Nurbanu Sultan, a Venetian patrician captured by pirates. She used her wit and beauty to become Selim's most trusted confidant. As Haseki Sultan, chief consort, and then as Valide Sultan when her son Murad III ascended, she ruled the empire from behind a lattice screen. She corresponded secretly with the Doge of Venice, brokering peace treaties that suited her homeland. She controlled appointments, dismissing grand viziers with a whisper. The corridors of Topkapi now echoed with the soft rustle of silk slippers, not the clank of armor. Selim II's reign, though peaceful, set a dangerous precedent. The campaign that defined it was not led by the Sultan, but by the brilliant vizier Sokola Mehmed Pasha. It was an audacious plan to dig a canal from the Don to the Volga rivers, to challenge Russian expansion, and open a route to Central Asia. But the real focus was the sea. In 1570, the Ottomans launched a massive campaign to take the island of Cyprus from the Venetians. The siege of Famagusta was brutal. The Venetian commander, Marco Antonio Bragadin, defended the city heroically for nearly a year. When he finally surrendered under promises of safe passage, the Ottoman commander, Lala Mustafa Pasha, flew into a rage and had Bragadin flayed alive, his skin stuffed with straw and paraded as a trophy. This act of barbarity united Christendom. Pope Pius V formed a holy league, Spain, Venice, Genoa, the Papal States. Their combined fleet met the Ottoman navy in the Gulf of Patras, near Lepanto, on October 7th, 1571. The Battle of Lepanto was the last great clash of oared galleys, a chaotic, close-quarters melee of over 400 ships. The carnage was apocalyptic. The sea turned red with blood. A young Spanish soldier named Miguel de Cervantes lost his left hand. The Ottomans lost over 200 ships and 30,000 men, including almost their entire cadre of experienced sailors. The news was met with jubilation in Europe, a crushing defeat. Yet, the empire's resilience was terrifying. The Grand Vizier Sokollu famously told the Venetian ambassador, "In wresting Cyprus from you, we cut off an arm. In defeating our fleet, you have only shaved our beard. An arm cannot grow back, but a shorn beard grows back thicker." He was right. Within a year, a new Ottoman fleet, larger than the one lost, was built. But Lepanto was a psychological wound. The myth of Ottoman invincibility at sea was shattered. The Sultanate of Women reached its zenith under Safavi Sultan, the favorite of Murad III and mother of Mehmed III. She was as cunning as her mother-in-law, Nurbanu. But the court was now a viper's nest of factionalism. The harem women, the black eunuchs who guarded them, the janissary commanders, and the palace bureaucrats were all locked in a perpetual, deadly struggle for influence. The empire was governed by bribery and intrigue. When Mehmed III ascended in 1595, his first act was a grim echo of the past. Fearful of rebellion, he ordered the execution of his 19 brothers. They were all strangled, the youngest just a few months old. It was the largest royal fratricide in Ottoman history. The sound of their mothers wailing from the harem was said to have haunted the palace for years. The 17th century saw a series of weak, disinterested sultans who preferred the pleasures of the palace to the burdens of the divan. Ahmed I, who came to the throne as a boy, was dominated by his mother and his favorite wife, Kozum Sultan. Kozum was perhaps the most powerful woman in Ottoman history, a Greek concubine of astonishing beauty and political genius. She would effectively rule the empire for 3 decades through the reigns of her husband, Ahmed I, and then her sons, Murad IV and Ibrahim, and her grandson, Mehmed IV. It was a period of decay. The Janissaries, once the disciplined spearhead of conquest, became a king-making Praetorian Guard. They married, engaged in trade, and refused to adopt new military technologies. The Devshirme system decayed, and positions were sold. The empire's military edge, the source of its power, was blunting. In Anatolia, a series of rebellions known as the Salali uprisings tore the heartland apart, fueled by banditry, inflation, and a disaffected military class. A brief flash of the old fire appeared with Sultan Murad IV, Kozum's son, who came of age in 1632. He was a throwback to his ancestors, a giant of a man, ruthless and strong. He found the capital in chaos, the Janissaries drunk on power. He imposed order with a reign of terror. He patrolled the streets at night in disguise, executing anyone he caught violating his strict laws against tobacco, coffee, and alcohol. He personally strangled a grand vizier with his own hands. He led a successful campaign to recapture Baghdad from the Persians in 1638. But Murad IV was the last sultan to lead an army in person. He died young of cirrhosis, and with him died the last hope of a return to the old ways. His successor was his brother, Ibrahim, known as Deli Ibrahim, Ibrahim the Mad. He was a creature of the harem, psychologically unstable, obsessed with furs and sable, and utterly controlled by his mother, Kozum. His extravagance and paranoia bankrupted the treasury and brought the state to the brink of collapse. In 1648, the Janissaries and the religious establishment had had enough. They stormed the palace, deposed Ibrahim, and strangled him. The next in line was his 7-year-old son, Mehmed IV. Power now fell completely into the hands of the boy's grandmother, the indomitable Kozum Sultan. But a new rival emerged, Mehmed's own mother, Turhan Sultan. A power struggle erupted between the two women of the harem. In 1651, it was settled in the most brutal way imaginable. Supporters of Turhan Sultan broke into Kozum's apartments in the dead of night. The old regent, who had ruled an empire for 30 years, tried to hide. Legend says the assassins found her and strangled her with her own long, gray hair. The Sultanate of Women was over. It had saved the empire from collapse during a century of weak sultans, but had also entrenched corruption and stagnation. The empire was like a magnificent but neglected palace. The gilded decorations were still stunning, but the foundations were cracking. The world outside was changing, and the Ottomans, gazing at their own reflection in the still waters of the Golden Horn, had failed to notice. Chapter 12. The Last Gasp, the Siege of Vienna, and the Age of the Copperless. The strangulation of Kozum Sultan was not just a murder, it was a seismic shift. The harem's grip on power was broken. The new sultan, Mehmed IV, was a child, and real authority passed to his mother, Turhan Sultan. But Turhan was wise enough to know she could not rule alone. The empire was in crisis. The treasury was empty. The Janissaries were mutinous. In Anatolia, bandit armies roamed freely. In the Mediterranean, the Venetian navy blockaded the Dardanelles. a humiliation unthinkable a century before. Desperate for a savior, Turhan made a momentous decision. She would appoint a grand vizier and grant him absolute power. Her choice fell on a man in his 70s, known for his integrity and iron will, Mehmed Kapraloo. The appointment came with brutal conditions. Kapraloo demanded a free hand, no interference from the palace, no appeals against his decisions. Turhan agreed. The old man arrived in Istanbul like an avenging angel. His method was simple, brutal, and effective: the purge. He compiled lists of corrupt officials, rebellious janissary officers, and disloyal governors. They were summoned, tried in summary courts, and executed. The heads of pashas adorned the walls of the capital. The Sipahi cavalry, who had grown fat on corrupt land grants, were decimated. It was a reign of terror, but it worked. Within a year, order was restored. The treasury began to refill. The Venetian blockade was broken. The Kapraloo era had begun. When Mehmed died in 1661, his son, Fazl Ahmed Kapraloo, succeeded him. He was a different man, a scholar who had studied in a madrasa, a man of culture, but he possessed the same iron core. For 15 years, the Kapraluus provided the empire with competent, ruthless leadership it had lacked for a century. They were the last great architects of the old order. Under Fazl Ahmed, the empire went back on the offensive. The target was Crete, the last major Venetian possession in the Aegean. The siege of the capital, Candia, had been dragging on for over 20 years. Fazl Ahmed took personal command. For 3 more years, the Ottomans tunneled and bombarded. The city finally fell in 1669. It was the last major Ottoman conquest. The empire now stretched from the gates of Vienna to the Persian Gulf, from the Crimea to the sands of Upper Egypt. It seemed, for a moment, that the decline had been reversed, but the heart of the problem remained. The Sultan, Mehmed IV, was now a man. His passion was not conquest, but hunting. He was known as Mehmed the Hunter. He spent years at a time in his hunting lodge at Edirne, leaving the business of state to his viziers. The court grew decadent, obsessed with tulips and pleasure gardens. The military, though temporarily disciplined by the Kapraluus, had not been fundamentally reformed. In 1676, Fazl Ahmed Kapraloo died. He was replaced by his brother-in-law, Kara Mustafa Pasha. Ambitious, arrogant, and hungry for glory, Kara Mustafa looked west. He saw a Europe divided by religious war and the rising power of France. He believed the time was ripe for the ultimate prize, Vienna. In the spring of 1683, the greatest army assembled since the days of Suleiman marched from Edirne. It was a multi-ethnic horde: Ottoman Turks, Tatars from the Crimea, Hungarians, Romanians, and Balkan Slavs. Kara Mustafa's tent was a mobile palace of silk and gold. He was so confident of victory that he brought along marble blocks to erect a victory monument in the captured city. He bypassed fortified Hungarian cities, his eyes fixed on the glittering prize. The siege of Vienna began in July. The Ottomans dug trenches, planted their massive cannons, and began to tunnel onto the walls. The Viennese, under the command of Count Ernst Rudiger von Starhemberg, defended with desperate courage. But the walls crumbled. Disease and hunger spread within the city. It seemed only a matter of time. What Kara Mustafa had fatally miscalculated was the unity of Christendom. The Pope begged the Polish king, Jan III Sobieski, to come to the rescue. Sobieski, a brilliant military leader, assembled a relief force of Poles, Germans, and Austrians. They marched over the Vienna woods, a range of hills overlooking the city. The dawn of September 12th 1683, broke with a strange quiet. Then, from the heights of the Kallenberg Hill, a mass of cavalry began to descend. They were the Polish winged hussars, Europe's finest heavy cavalry. They wore wings of eagle feathers on their backs, which created a terrifying, whistling sound as they charged. They came down the slope like an avalanche, 1,000 lances pointing at the heart of the Ottoman camp. Kara Mustafa had deployed his army for a siege, not a field battle. The shock was absolute. The Ottoman lines buckled, then broke. The camp, a city of treasure and luxury, was overrun. The siege turned into a rout. Kara Mustafa fled, abandoning his standard, his treasure, and even his sacred green flag of the Prophet. He would later be executed in Belgrade on the Sultan's orders, strangled with a silk cord. The defeat at Vienna was a catastrophe from which the Ottoman Empire never truly recovered. It was not just a lost battle, it was the end of an era. A Holy League of Austria, Poland, Venice, and Russia was formed. For the next 16 years, the Ottomans were pushed back on all fronts. The Habsburgs conquered Hungary. The Venetians invaded Greece. The Russians, under the young Tsar Peter the Great, captured the fortress of Azov. The war ended with the Treaty of Karlowitz in 1699. For the first time in its history, the Ottoman Empire was forced to sign a peace treaty not as an equal, but as a defeated power, ceding vast territories permanently. The mood in Istanbul was one of profound shock and humiliation. The relentless expansion was over. The long, slow, painful contraction had begun. The tree of Osman had not just been pruned. Its deepest roots had been shaken. Chapter 13. The Tulip and the Powder Keg, an Age of Illusions. The shock of Karlowitz settled over Istanbul like a fine, cold ash. The coffee houses, once buzzing with talk of inevitable victory, now hummed with a new, anxious energy. The unthinkable had happened. The House of War had not only held, it had struck back, and the House of Islam had been found wanting. The empire felt old, its joints creaking, its once sharp vision clouded. The 18th century was a long, slow convalescence, punctuated by fevered dreams of lost glory. The first response was not innovation, but nostalgia. Sultan Ahmed III, who came to the throne in 1703, presided over the Tulip era. It was a time of exquisite, fragile beauty, a desperate attempt to build a paradise within the crumbling walls. The capital's elite became obsessed with tulips. New varieties were cultivated, given poetic names like Light of the Paradise and Diamond's Envy. Tulip festivals were held on moonlit nights in the grand gardens along the Golden Horn, with tortoises carrying candles on their backs to illuminate the flowers. The air was thick with the scent of blossoms and the sound of poetry. Ahmed III built the stunning Sadabad Palace, a pleasure pavilion inspired by Versailles. He established the first official printing press in the Muslim world, operated by Ibrahim Bouteflika, a Hungarian convert. But the press was strictly controlled, allowed only to print non-religious texts, maps, histories, manuals on mathematics, for fear of angering the powerful guild of scribes and conservative clerics. The Tulip Age was a gilded cage, a world of surface-level sophistication that ignored the rot in the foundations. The reforms were cosmetic, the modernization a phantom. The illusion shattered in 1730 with the Patrona Halil Rebellion. Patrona Halil was a former janissary, an Albanian bath attendant who embodied the discontent of the common people. They were weary of the Sultan's extravagance while the empire lost wars and the economy stagnated. The rebellion began in the taverns and markets. A mob, led by Patrona Halil, stormed the Topkapi Palace. The Grand Vizier was torn to pieces. Ahmed III was forced to abdicate in favor of his nephew, Mahmud I. The Tulip Gardens were trampled, the Saadabad Palace looted. The message was clear: the empire could not afford the luxury of decadence. The rest of a century was a wearying cycle of war and stagnation. There were flashes of military competence. The brilliant Ottoman Admiral Ghazi Hassan Pasha managed to destroy the Russian fleet at the Battle of Sezim in 1770, though the war itself was ultimately lost. But these were defensive actions holding actions. The enemy was no longer just Austria or Venice. A new, brutal power was rising in the north, the Russian Empire. Under Catherine the Great, Russia declared itself the protector of the Orthodox Christians within the Ottoman Empire, a pretext for intervention that would be used for the next 150 years. The Treaty of Kukuk-Kanarka in 1774 was another humiliation, granting Russia the right to intervene in Ottoman affairs and carving off the Crimean Khanate, the empire's oldest Muslim ally. It was against this backdrop of relentless pressure that a new kind of sultan emerged, Selim III. Ascending the throne in 1789, he was a modernizer, a man who looked at Europe not with disdain, but with a desperate need to learn. He was a musician, a composer, a man of enlightenment. He understood that the empire's survival depended on a radical change. His vision was called the Nizam-I Seded, the New Order. At its heart was a new army, trained and dressed in a European style, armed with modern artillery and bayonets, and led by officers educated in new military schools. He established permanent embassies in European capitals so the Ottomans could finally understand the world they were dealing with. He reformed the treasury and tried to centralize the fractious provincial governments. But the Nizam-I Seded threatened every entrenched interest in the empire. The Janissaries saw it as an existential threat to their privileges. The conservative religious scholars decried it as an imitation of the infidel. The provincial notables feared the loss of their autonomy. Selim III was a reformer ahead of his time, and he moved too quickly. In 1807, the powder keg ignited. The Janissaries, with the support of conservative factions, revolted. They overturned their great soup cauldrons in the Hippodrome, the traditional signal of rebellion. The streets of Istanbul became a battleground. Selim, trying to avoid a bloodbath, dissolved his new army and abdicated in favor of his cousin, Mustafa IV. He was imprisoned in the palace harem, but the forces of reform were not yet extinguished. A group of loyalists rallied around Selim's brother, Mahmud. As they stormed the palace to free him and place him back on the throne, Mustafa IV, in a final act of desperation, gave the order that would echo through history: kill them both. The executioners found Selim III first. The enlightened sultan, the composer of delicate music, was murdered in the dark, cramped rooms where he was held. His last moments were a struggle against the mutes who strangled him. His brother Mahmud, however, escaped through a chimney and was proclaimed Sultan Mahmud II. He never forgot the sound of his cousin's murder. He would bide his time for nearly 2 decades, playing a careful, patient game. But the lesson of Selim III was seared into his soul. Reform was necessary, but to succeed, it had to be built on the ashes of the old guard. The Janissaries, the proud corps that had conquered Constantinople, had become the greatest obstacle to the empire's survival. Their days were numbered. Chapter 14. The Auspicious Incident, the End of the Old Order. The scent of blood and betrayal hung heavy in the Topkapi harem long after Selim III's body was carried away. For Mahmud II, the new sultan, the memory was a brand seared upon his mind. The sight of his cousin's lifeless form, the desperate scramble up a soot-choked chimney to save his own life. These were not the stuff of imperial legend. They were the raw, terrifying facts of power in a decaying empire. Mahmud wore the crown, but he was a prisoner of the very forces that had murdered Selim. The Janissaries, the conservative ulama, the corrupt palace factions. For 18 years, Mahmud II ruled with a mask of acquiescence. He was a slight man with a calm, almost timid demeanor. He allowed the Janissaries their privileges. He consulted the conservative elders. He gave no outward sign of the storm gathering within him. But in the secret chambers of the palace, a different man was at work. He studied the reports from his ambassadors in Europe. He pored over maps of Napoleon's campaigns. He understood that the empire was dying of internal paralysis. The Janissaries, the once formidable corps, now little more than a hereditary guild of shopkeepers and thugs, were a tumor in the body of the state. They resisted every innovation, every attempt to modernize the army. Their loyalty was not to the Sultan, but to their own privileges. The spark came from the edges of the empire. In Greece, a national uprising erupted in 1821. The Greeks, inspired by the Enlightenment and European nationalism, fought for independence. The war was brutal, marked by atrocities on both sides. The Ottoman Egyptian fleet was powerful, but the European powers, Britain, France, and Russia, sympathized with the Greeks. In 1827, at the Battle of Navarino, the combined European fleet annihilated the Ottoman Egyptian armada in a surprise attack. It was a humiliation of the highest order. The empire's weakness was exposed for all the world to see. For Mahmud, Navarino was the final proof. The old ways had failed. The empire needed a modern army, or it would be carved up by the Europeans. He began his preparations with the patience of a spider. He quietly built up a new artillery corps, loyal directly to him. He appointed a ruthless, determined Grand Vizier, Benderli Mehmed Selim Pasha. The plan was set for the summer of 1826. The pretext was a new military unit, the Eskinci Corps, which would be trained in European drills. When the Janissaries got wind of it, they reacted exactly as Mahmud had predicted. On June 14th, they gathered in the Hippodrome, the ancient heart of the city, and overturned their massive copper soup cauldrons, the sacred symbol of their corps and the traditional signal of revolt. They expected the Sultan to back down, as his predecessors had. They were met with silence. Then the sound of cannon being wheeled into position. Mahmud had raised the sacred standard of the Prophet from the palace treasury. He stood before it, declaring the Janissaries to be rebels against both the state and the faith. The artillery corps, his new creation, opened fire on the Hippodrome. The cannonballs tore through the packed ranks of the Janissaries. They had not come to fight a battle. They had come to protest. They were massacred where they stood. The auspicious incident had begun. For days, the slaughter continued. Government troops hunted down Janissaries throughout the city. Their barracks were shelled and burned. Their members were executed by the thousands. The order went out to the provinces. Every Janissary was to be put to death. It was a systematic, merciless extermination. The corps that had conquered Constantinople, that had been the iron fist of Suleiman and Mehmed, was erased from existence. The streets of Istanbul ran with blood, and the air was thick with the smell of smoke and death. With the old guard annihilated, Mahmud II unleashed a whirlwind of reform. He was now the undisputed master. He created a new, European-style army, which he named the Asakarai Manchurai Mohammadi, the victorious soldiers of Muhammad. He abolished the feudal Timar system, replacing it with a centralized administration. He replaced the traditional turbans in robes of officials with the fez and the frock coat, a visual revolution that shocked the conservative populace. He established the first official newspaper, the Takvimai Vakayai calendar of events. He was dismantling the medieval Ottoman state and trying to build a modern one in its place. But the empire's problems were deeper than military reform. The virus of nationalism, born of the French Revolution, was spreading. Serbia had already gained autonomy. Greece became an independent kingdom in 1832. The empire was shrinking, its Christian provinces peeling away, often with the help of Russia. Mahmud's final years were consumed by a crisis with Muhammad Ali, the powerful Ottoman governor of Egypt. Muhammad Ali had built a modern state of his own and craved independence. His armies, led by his son Ibrahim Pasha, smashed the Ottoman forces and marched deep into Anatolia. In desperation, Mahmud was forced to accept the help of his ancient enemy, Russia, to save his throne. The price was further humiliation. Mahmud II died of tuberculosis in 1839, his reforms incomplete, his empire still in peril. But he had broken the back of the old order. He had created a blank slate. As he lay dying, the empire's first major railway was being planned, and the first steamships were entering the Golden Horn. The 19th century had finally arrived at the Ottoman doorstep. The task of answering its challenges would fall to his son and to a new generation of bureaucrats who believed the empire could still be saved. They would call their project Tanzimat, reorganization. It was to be the most ambitious reform program in Ottoman history, a final, desperate attempt to build a bridge between the empire of the past and the modern world. Chapter 15: The Rose Garden of Reform, the Tanzimat and the Seeds of Dissolution. The death of Mahmud II in 1839 was not an end, but a frantic passing of the baton. His 16-year-old son, Abdolmecid I, ascended the throne to the sound of Egyptian cannons. Ibrahim Pasha's army was camped in Anatolia, and the empire teetered on the brink of collapse. The only thing that saved it was the intervention of the European powers, who feared the balance of power would be upset if Egypt grew too strong. But the rescue came with a condition: the empire must reform. In a dramatic ceremony held in the Rose Garden of the Topkapi Palace, the young sultan's foreign minister, Mustafa Razid Pasha, read aloud a magnificent imperial decree. This was the Hat-eye Serif of Gulhane, the noble edict of the Rose Chamber. Its words were revolutionary. It promised security of life, honor, and property for all Ottoman subjects, Muslim and non-Muslim alike. It established a fair system of taxation and military conscription. It promised an end to corruption. The Tanzimat, the reorganization, had begun. For the next 4 decades, a cadre of brilliant Western-educated bureaucrats tried to build a modern, centralized state. They were men like Ali Pasha and Fuad Pasha, who believed the empire could be saved by becoming a constitutional, multinational state, an Ottoman nation bound by common citizenship rather than religious identity. They wrote new legal codes based on the French model. They built schools, railways, and telegraph lines. The first opera house opened in Istanbul. The capital began to look like a European city, with gaslights illuminating new boulevards. But the Tanzimat was a beautiful dream built on a foundation of sand. For the conservative Muslim population, these reforms were a betrayal. Why should Christians, who were already seeking independence, be given equal status? For the Christian populations, it was too little, too late. They no longer wanted equality within the empire. They wanted national independence. The reform satisfied almost no one. The empire became a playground for the European powers, who now styled themselves as protectors of various groups. Russia was the protector of the Orthodox. France was the protector of the Catholics. Britain, claiming to support the empire's integrity, was often the most meddlesome of all. The sick man of Europe was now surrounded by doctors who were secretly drawing up plans to divide his estate. The Crimean War, 1853 to 1856, was a perfect illustration of this bizarre new reality. The Ottoman Empire went to war with Russia and found itself allied with Britain and France. It was a war fought on Ottoman soil to preserve the Ottoman state, but it was directed by European generals. The empire was a patient on the operating table, while foreign surgeons argued over the procedure. The war was won, but the cost was staggering debt to European banks. The empire was now financially as well as politically shackled. The latter part of the Tanzimat saw the reigns of two very different sultans. Abdulaziz, who ruled from 1861 to 1876, was a giant of a man with immense energy. He traveled to Europe, the first sultan to do so, visiting the Paris Exposition and the courts of London and Vienna. He was determined to prove the Ottomans were European power. He built a massive navy, second only to Britain's. He constructed the grandiose Dolmabahce Palace on the Bosphorus, a monument of Baroque and Rococo extravagance meant to rival Versailles. But it was all a facade. The debt from his projects and the Crimean War crippled the treasury. The economy was in shambles. A new generation was coming of age, educated in the Western-style schools the Tanzimat had built. They were the Young Ottomans, a group of intellectuals, journalists, and junior officials. They believed the Tanzimat had not gone far enough. The problem was not a lack of laws, but a lack of freedom. The solution was not a stronger bureaucracy, but a constitution and a parliament. They published fiery newspapers from exile in Paris and London, their words smuggled back into the empire, igniting the minds of a disaffected elite. By 1876, the empire was in crisis. A rebellion had broken out in Bulgaria, suppressed by Ottoman irregulars with such brutality that it caused outrage across Europe. The treasury was bankrupt. The Grand Vizier, Mahmud Nedim Pasha, was widely seen as a puppet of Russia. In Istanbul, a strange alliance formed. The liberal young Ottomans, conservative Muslim clerics, and a war minister, Midhat Pasha, a leading reformer. They decided the Sultan had to go. On May 30th, 1876, a fatwa, or legal Islamic rule, was issued declaring Abdulaziz unfit to rule. He was deposed. His nephew, Murad V, a poet and a sympathizer with the young Ottomans, was placed on the throne. But the victory was short-lived. A few days later, Abdulaziz was found dead in his apartments in the Farai Palace. The official story was suicide, but the whispers of murder were immediate and persistent. The shock was too much for the sensitive, unstable Murad V. He suffered a complete mental breakdown. The reformers were left with a comatose sultan and an empire on the brink of collapse. In a final, desperate gamble, they turned to Murad's younger brother, Abdulhamid. He seemed intelligent, quiet, and pliable. They presented him with a condition for his accession. He must grant a constitution. On December 23, 1876, in a grand ceremony at the Dolmabahce Palace, the first Ottoman constitution was proclaimed. It established a parliament and guaranteed basic rights. It was the crowning achievement of the Tanzimat, the moment the empire seemed to step into the modern world. Midhat Pasha, the father of the constitution, believed he had saved the empire. But as the cannons boomed in celebration, the new sultan, Abdulhamid II, watched with inscrutable eyes. He had agreed to the constitution, but he had no intention of being its servant. The reformers had unleashed a force they did not understand. The age of reform was over. The age of absolutism was about to return with a vengeance. Chapter 16. The Red Sultan and the Storm Clouds. The Age of Abdulhamid II. The cannons that saluted the new constitution on that bleak December day in 1876 did not signal a dawn, but a false one. The ceremony in the Dalmabas Palace was a masterpiece of illusion. Midhat Pasha, the great reformer, stood beaming, believing he had chained the Sultan to the will of the people. The foreign ambassadors looked on, hopeful that the sick man was at last reforming himself. But the man at the center of the pageant, Sultan Abdulhamid II, observed it all with the calm, detached eyes of a chess master. He had read the Constitution, he had agreed to it, and he had already begun planning its demise. The pretext came swiftly. Within months, the empire was at war with Russia again. The conflict was a disaster. Russian armies swept to the very gates of Istanbul, stopped only by the threat of British intervention. The Treaty of San Stefano, and later the Congress of Berlin in 1878, carve away vast territories in the Balkans. Romania, Serbia, and Montenegro gained full independence. Bulgaria was created as an autonomous principality. The empire in Europe was reduced to a sliver of land. Abdulhamid acted. He suspended the constitution. He dissolved the parliament after its first session. He sent Midhat Pasha into exile and would later have him strangled in the dark dungeons of Taif prison. The experiment in democracy was over. For the next 3 decades, Abdulhamid would rule as the last absolute monarch of the Ottoman Empire. His was a rule of paradoxes. He was a modernizer who despised modernity. He expanded the railway and telegraph systems, not to open the empire, but to control it more tightly. The telegraph wires became the nerves of a vast spy network. His secret police, the Hafi, were everywhere. Informers whispered in coffee houses. Newspapers were shuttered. Intellectuals fled to Paris and Geneva. The Sublime Porte, once the seat of government, was sidelined. All power flowed to the Sultan's isolated study in the Yildiz Palace, a fortified complex high above the Bosphorus, where he pored over reports and issued commands, a prisoner of his own paranoia. To hold his fracturing empire together, Abdulhamid championed a new ideology, pan-Islamism. He emphasized his role as caliph, the leader of all the world's Muslims. He built the Hijaz Railway, with donations from Muslims worldwide, to link Damascus to Medina, facilitating the pilgrimage and binding the Arab world closer to Istanbul. He presented himself as the universal defender of Islam against the encroaching Christian powers. This resonated with millions of Muslims from India to Africa, but it alienated the empire's remaining Christian subjects even further. The reign of Abdulhamid II was also stained by blood. In the eastern provinces of Anatolia, the Armenian population, inspired by the nationalist movements of the Balkans, began to agitate for reforms and autonomy. Abdulhamid saw this not as a legitimate grievance, but as a separatist threat backed by Russia. In 1894, mass protests were met with horrific violence. Kurdish irregulars, the Hamidai regiments created by the Sultan, were unleashed upon Armenian villages. The massacres of 1894 to 1896 were not a battle, but a pogrom. Tens of thousands of Armenians were slaughtered. The world looked on in horror, and Abdulhamid earned his nickname in the Western press, the Red Sultan. The seeds of a far greater tragedy were sown in this soil of fear and hatred. Yet, repression could not stamp out the desire for change. The very schools Abdulhamid had built to create loyal officials instead produced a generation of revolutionaries. In the military academies, young officers whispered about liberty and the Constitution. In exile, the Young Turks, a new, more radical movement than their predecessors, plotted his downfall. Their leading organization was the Committee of Union and Progress. The end began not in Istanbul, but in the remote hills of Macedonia. In the summer of 1908, a young cup major named Ahmed Niazi, fearing his discovery, took to the hills with his troops and declared a revolution for the restoration of the Constitution. The act was like a spark in a dry forest. The rebellion spread rapidly through the Ottoman Third Army. Abdulhamid, realizing the army would not crush its own, capitulated. On July 24, 1908, he announced the restoration of the Constitution. The empire erupted in joy. Muslims, Christians, and Jews embraced in the streets. It was a carnival of freedom, the Young Turk Revolution. But the joy was short-lived. In April 1909, a conservative Islamist counter-revolution erupted in Istanbul, fueled by grievances against the secularizing Young Turks. For 2 weeks, the city was in the hands of rebels who shouted, "We want Sharia." The Young Turk leadership seemed finished. They had not accounted for the resolve of one man. Mustafa Kemal, a young staff officer stationed in Salonika. He helped organize a force called the Action Army, which marched on Istanbul. The counter-revolution was crushed with brutal efficiency. The Young Turks were back in power, and this time they were not taking chances. They needed a scapegoat for the chaos. On April 27, 1909, a delegation from the Ottoman Parliament arrived at the Yildiz Palace. They found Abdulhamid in his library, calmly playing the piano. The fatwa of deposition was read to him. His crime was suppression of the Constitution and complicity in the counter-revolution. He listened impassively. His only question was about his personal safety. Assured he would not be harmed, he abdicated. That night, under heavy guard, he was put on a train to Salonika, a prisoner in his own country. The 33-year reign of the last absolute sultan was over. The Young Turks now held the reins of a bankrupt, shrunken, and deeply troubled empire. They were men of the 20th century, full of modernizing zeal and nationalist fervor. They believed they could save the empire by making it more Turkish, more centralized, more efficient. They did not realize they were now at the helm of a ship that was already heading for the greatest iceberg in history. The storm clouds of a world war were gathering, and the Ottoman Empire, brittle and desperate, was about to be swept into the heart of the tempest. Chapter 17. The Final Descent. War, Fire, and the End of an Era. The train carrying the deposed Sultan Abdulhamid II into exile in Salonika was a ghost ship gliding through the night. Inside, the fallen caliph sat in silence, a library of secrets and sorrows locked within him. Behind him, the Committee of Union and Progress, latter called CUP. The Young Turks took control of an empire that was less an empire and more a collection of frayed nerves and simmering hatreds. They were young, they were modern, they were fiercely nationalist, and they were utterly unprepared for the abyss that awaited. The CUP's dream of a constitutional, multi-ethnic Ottoman state evaporated almost immediately. In 1911, Italy invaded the North African province of Tripolitania. Then, in 1912, the Balkan League, Serbia, Bulgaria, Greece, and Montenegro launched a coordinated attack. The ensuing Balkan Wars were a catastrophe of unprecedented scale. The Ottoman armies, riddled with political intrigue and poor leadership, collapsed. Edirne, the empire's second capital, fell. Hundreds of thousands of Muslim refugees streamed into Istanbul, bringing with them tales of massacre and expulsion. The empire in Europe was all but lost. The air in the capital was thick with humiliation and a thirst for revenge. It was in this atmosphere of paranoid desperation that the CUP made its fateful choice. In the summer of 1914, the lights were going out all over Europe. The CUP leadership, particularly the ambitious triumvirate known as the Three Pashas, Enver, Tullett, and Semel, saw the war as a perilous opportunity. They secretly signed a treaty with Germany, believing the Kaiser's army was invincible. On October 29, 1914, without a formal declaration of war, German-officered Ottoman warships, including the battlecruiser Goeben, Yavuz Sultan Selim shelled Russian ports on the Black Sea. The Ottoman Empire had entered the First World War. The war was an unmitigated disaster from the start. Enver Pasha, the Minister of War, a man of vaulting ambition and limited talent, launched a suicidal winter offensive against the Russians in the Caucasus. At the Battle of Sarakamis, an entire army, nearly 90,000 men, was lost to the Russian winter, freezing to death in the mountain passes. It was a defeat so complete it was kept secret for years. But the defining struggle, the one that would forge a nation from the ashes of empire, was about to unfold on a narrow, rugged peninsula called Gallipoli. In April 1915, a massive Allied fleet of British, French, Australian, and New Zealand troops launched an amphibious assault to force the Dardanelles, capture Istanbul, and knock the Ottomans out of the war. The plan was predicated on the belief that the Ottoman soldier was inferior and would break. They did not account for the resolve of the defenders, and one man in particular, a young lieutenant colonel named Mustafa Kemal. On the day of the landings, as Anzac troops scrambled up the cliffs at a cove, now known as Anzac Cove, it was Kemal who, acting on his own initiative, rushed his 19th Division to the critical heights of Chunuk Bair. "I'm not ordering you to attack," he told his exhausted men. "I'm ordering you to die. In the time it takes for us to die, other forces and commanders can come and take our place." The line held. For 8 grueling months, the battle raged. It was a hell of sniper fire, dysentery, and relentless artillery barges. The Turks fought with a desperate courage, defending their homeland. The Allies eventually withdrew, defeated. Mustafa Kemal became a national hero, a Ghazi. Yet, even as the nation celebrated this victory, a darker shadow was falling over the empire. The CUP government, led by Tullett Pasha, had come to view the Armenian population in the eastern provinces as a fifth column, a potential ally for the invading Russians. In the spring of 1915, what began as the deportation of Armenians from war zones escalated into a systematic campaign of extermination. Orders were sent in coded telegrams. Death marches into the deserts of Syria were organized. Men were shot. Women and children died of starvation and exposure. The world's first modern genocide was underway, claiming an estimated 1.5 million lives. It was a crime that would scar the soul of the new nation rising from the empire's ruins. The war ground on. In the deserts of Arabia, the British fomented a revolt. Lawrence of Arabia, helped unite Arab tribes under Sharif Hussein of Mecca. The Arab revolt cut the Hejaz Railway and pinned down Ottoman troops. In Mesopotamia and Palestine, British armies advanced steadily. By 1918, the empire was defeated on all fronts. The Three Pashas fled the country aboard a German submarine. On October 30th, 1918, aboard the British battleship HMS Agamemnon in the port of Mudros, an armistice was signed. The Ottoman Empire surrendered unconditionally. Allied warships sailed unopposed up the Dardanelles. British, French, Italian, and Greek troops occupied Istanbul. The great mosques of the city were shadowed by the crosses of invading armies. The Ottoman parliament was dissolved. The Sultan, Mehmed VI Vahdettin, became a puppet in his own palace. It seemed the final, ignominious chapter was being written. The sick man was dead, and the vultures were dividing the corpse. But in the heart of Anatolia, a spark remained. Mustafa Kemal, now a national figure, saw the occupation as the final betrayal. Disguised as a civilian, he slipped out of Istanbul aboard the rickety steamer Bandurma. He landed in Samsun on May 19, 1919, under the pretext of inspecting Ottoman troops. His real mission was to organize a national resistance. What followed was the Turkish War of Independence. From Ankara, a dusty town in the Anatolian heartland, Kemal built a new government and new army. He fought a war on multiple fronts, against the French in the south, the Armenians in the east, and most formidably against the Greek army, which, with Allied backing, had invaded deep into Anatolia, dreaming of recreating a Byzantine empire on Turkish soil. The war reached its climax in August 1922 at the Battle of Dumlupınar. Kemal's forces shattered the Greek army. The Greek retreat turned into a rout, then a catastrophe. On September 9th, Turkish cavalry rode into the burning city of Izmir as the last Greek soldiers fled onto Allied warships in the harbor. The war was won. In Istanbul, the last Ottoman Sultan, Mehmed VI, knew his time was up. On November 17th, 1922, he slipped out of the Dolmabahce Palace, entering a British ambulance that carried him to a waiting warship. He went into exile, a ghost leaving a stage he no longer recognized. The Grand National Assembly in Ankara abolished the Sultanate. The Ottoman Empire, a state that had endured for 623 years, was no more. A single, symbolic office remained, the Caliphate. It was bestowed upon a cousin, Abdülmecid II, a dignified, scholarly man who became a figurehead without a throne. He resided in Istanbul, a living relic, a ghost of the past in a city straining towards the future. For 16 months, this strange duality persisted. But for Mustafa Kemal and the new Turkish Republic, the Caliphate was an anachronism, a link to the theocratic, imperial past he was determined to erase. On March 3rd, 1924, the Assembly voted to abolish the Caliphate. Abdülmecid was given a few hours to pack. He performed his final prayers in the palace, gathered his family and his books, and was driven to the station. There was no crowd, no ceremony. He boarded the Orient Express and vanished into European exile. The last thread was cut. The great tree of Osman, which had grown from a dream on the Anatolian steppe, whose branches had once cast a shadow from Vienna to the Indian Ocean, had finally fallen. All that remained was the silence in the vast, empty palaces of Istanbul and the echoes of a glory that had passed into history. A new nation, built on the ashes of empire, was now turning its face towards the sun.